Hey everyone, I'm Nick Ravelis, the Director of Community Engagement for San Diego Opera. You've got tickets to see our next production here at San Diego Opera, Giuseppe Verdi's Falstaff. We're doing two of Verdi's operas this year, Falstaff and La Traviata, two operas that are separated by 40 years. Verdi had a very long career as an opera composer, writing nearly 30 operas, extending over a career that lasted 50 years. In fact, he was 80 years old when he finished Falstaff, and many people consider it to be his crowning achievement. But I want to back up a bit because the origin of Falstaff is just as important as the opera. Sir John Falstaff, a fat knight in Elizabethan England who's seen better days and is low on money because he's spent it all on eating, drinking, and chasing women. A man who thinks way too highly of himself, who proudly brags about things that are either not true or highly exaggerated. This is the character created by the greatest playwright in the English language, William Shakespeare. Falstaff appears in two of Shakespeare's so-called history plays, plays about important historical characters in England's past, Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2. In these two plays, Falstaff is portrayed as an older pal and carouser with King Henry V. It's said that Queen Elizabeth loved the character of Falstaff so much that she asked Shakespeare to write another play that would feature the character in love. In response, he wrote The Merry Wives of Windsor, a comedy in which Falstaff, now low on funds, decides to try to seduce two different women, Alice Ford and Meg Page, knowing that their husbands are very wealthy and that somehow all that money will rub off on him. The mistake Falstaff makes is to write the exact same love letter to both women. Of course, they compare notes, realize Falstaff's deception, and spend the rest of the play outwitting and tricking him. In fact, they absolutely humiliate him, and even though Falstaff is a blowhard and a fool, he's treated so badly by the end of the comedy that we even begin to feel a little sorry for him. Giuseppe Verdi loved the plays of Shakespeare and is quoted as being familiar with them since childhood. Now, he didn't speak or read English, so he must have known these plays in an Italian translation, and he was always looking at Shakespeare plays to use as stories for his opera. He was successful in doing that on 3 occasions. He wrote an opera based on Macbeth in 1847, and then at the end of his life, Otello, based on Othello, in 1887, and then Falstaff in 1893. A number of composers throughout history have based their operas on Shakespeare plays or on Shakespeare characters, probably because the characters are so vivid and their stories are so interesting. The one play that Verdi wanted to get around to eventually was King Lear. Unfortunately, that project was never completed. Now, as in most operas, the composer does not write the words. He or she only writes the music. In Italian, the text or script of an opera is called a libretto, a little book, literally. It was called this because way before Verdi's time, it became the tradition for the text of an opera, the words, to be printed in a small pocketbook that audience members could bring with them so that they could understand what was being sung. The author of the libretto became known as the librettist, or simply known as the poet. The poet in the case of Verdi's Falstaff was Arrigo Boito, who was not only a brilliant wordsmith, but a composer as well. So he had a good feel for how words should be set to music and provided Verdi a perfect poetic text to match the Shakespeare original. Now, even though Boito was working in the Italian language and not in English, he still wanted to get the flavor of Shakespearean speech. And, well, he comes very close to the spirit of the original. Now, because this is a comedy, the overall color of the opera is bright, the tempos are fast, and rather than being lyrical like some other Italian operas, it has more of the feel of a straight play, moving very quickly from one moment to the next. It is, in fact, a play set to music. Like Shakespeare's plays, some of the characters get monologues, or what we call soliloquies. These are times when a character stops and reflects on what's going on around him, using very poetic language. This is perfect for the opera stage, of course, because that moment of reflection is something that's really common in opera. It's called an aria. Characters sing an aria when their emotions are ready to spill over, and they channel that emotion through song. It's just that in Falstaff, these soliloquies or arias are funny and not especially song-like. Falstaff's arias come off like sung speech, not what you would usually expect of an opera aria. But again, this is like a regular play. It's just that everything is sung. So, what about the music? Well, by this point in Verdi's career, 50 years after it began, the music is very different. Don't expect big, beautiful, flourishing melodies like we might hear in other operas during this time, the late 19th century. Falstaff premiered in 1893, right on the cusp of the 20th century. All sorts of things were happening in the world. In fact, in a brief 13 years, World War I was to begin. That event didn't happen in a vacuum. All sorts of things led up to it. The violence, political upheaval, social changes that fed into that war were occurring during the time of Falstaff's composition. Well, developments in music and opera were no different. Lots of changes were happening. Music was changing, in some ways radically. Art was changing, architecture, poetry, sculpture, literature, all changing and reflecting the world that the artists were experiencing themselves. I don't know whether you'll be able to hear it, because it may be that Falstaff will be your first opera. But take it from me, it's different from any of the operas that Verdi wrote up to that time, and different from operas by composers of his day. The one thing that I think you'll be able to hear is that the music is very, very sensitive to the words, the text. The words that Falstaff and his companions sing are highlighted, underlined, or described through the music. If you listen very carefully, every word, every image is commented on or described through the music. You can experience this sensitivity in Falstaff's monologue at the end of Act 1. His henchmen, Bardolph and Pistol, had failed to do what Falstaff asked them. They were to deliver these love letters to the women Alice Ford and Meg Page, and they decided not to deliver them because it was contrary to their sense of honor. Falstaff really lays into them and delivers this sarcastic soliloquy.
Voi state liger l'onor vostro, voi cloate digna media, quando non sempre noi possiam star regi al nostro. Io stesso, sì, io, devo dolor da un lato, porre il timor di Dio, e per necessità sviar l'onore, usare stratagemmi equivoci, destreggiar, mordeggiare, e voi che vostri cenci e con l'occhiata torba di gatto pardo dei feti disegnazzi avete a scorta il vostro onor, che onore, che onore, che onore, che cenci, che moglie!
In another example, at the beginning of the last act, Falstaff sings about how good a glass of wine fills his belly and makes every fiber of his being quiver with excitement.
Il buon vino sperde le tetre folle dello sconforto, accende l'occhio il pensier, dal labbro sale al cervel, e qui vi risveglia il picciol fabbro dei trilli, un negro grillo che vibra entro l'ombrillo, trillo di fibra in cor, l'allegro ete al trillo guizza, e il giocondo globo squilibra una demenza trillante,
in the orchestra, as well as his voice, gives us a splendid depiction of what he feels at that moment. Maybe that's the thing that we should listen for when attending a performance of Falstaff. It's an opera of the moment. Every emotion, every movement is underlined right away with immediacy in real time. And that's why Verdi doesn't give us big melodies or tunes. He wants us to experience this play like it's happening right now in front of us, sparing no time for reflection or thinking. It's a perfect opera for young people who appreciate things that happen in the now. And for an 80-year-old man to have written that way, well, it's just remarkable.